So this Wednesday, like I mentioned, is Ash Wednesday, meaning that this Wednesday, the season of Lent begins. And it's in this season that we follow Jesus along with his disciples on his final trip to Jerusalem and his final Passover. And the passage today is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9. And before I read that passage, I'm going to introduce it a little bit. In this chapter, among other things, we see the different elements of Jesus' life and mission coming together and seeming to collide. We see the contradictions and the conflicts, or maybe more appropriately, we see the mysteries and the paradoxes contained within Jesus and within his calling. And we see his disciples struggling to understand and struggling to accept his calling. Our lectionary passage for today begins with Jesus taking Peter and John and James up on a mountain to pray with him. And this is the scene of Jesus' transfiguration, or Jesus' transformation. But to appreciate the power of this event and this revelation, I think we need to consider its place in Luke chapter 9, what comes before it and what comes after it. So I'm going to do a little summary of chapter 9 leading up to the transfiguration. So at the beginning of chapter 9, Herod has heard about this person, Jesus. He's heard about the miracles and the healings that he's been performing, and he is perplexed. Some people are telling him that Jesus is John the Baptist, back from the dead. Others are saying that Jesus is the reincarnated Elijah, who is expected to return to the earth before the day of the Lord. And other people are saying that he is some other ancient prophet come back to life. And so Herod says, I beheaded John the Baptist. But who is this about whom I hear such things? Who is this? That is the question. Who is this person, Jesus? A few verses later, after Jesus has fed the 5,000 with just a couple of loaves and fishes, he asks his disciples that very same question that Herod was asking. Who are people saying that I am? The disciples give him the same answers. They say, well, some people think you're John the Baptist. Some people think you're Elijah. Some people think that you are a different prophet. And then Jesus asks a more pointed question. Okay, but who do you say that I am? And Peter, for the first time, answers boldly, you are the Messiah of God. This is the first time that Peter or any of the disciples make this declaration. And somewhat confusingly, Jesus answers by sternly ordering them, don't tell anybody about this. So this is the question. Who is this person, Jesus? Now the disciples have an answer. He's the Messiah. But strangely, upon Peter's declaration, there's no fanfare, there's no celebration, there is no hint of triumphalism. Because right after this, Jesus gives them a little bit more information, and it is confusing. So he says, the Son of Man will have to undergo great suffering. He is going to be rejected. He's going to be rejected by the elders, the scribes, the chief priests, and he is going to be killed. And after 3 days, he will be raised. And if anyone wants to become my follower, they must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So in this short span of just a few verses, the disciples learn two seemingly contradictory things about Jesus and about who he is, right? That central question. So they have learned that Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one, and at the same time, he's going to be rejected and killed. This is the conflict that is on the disciples' minds as Jesus leads them up the mountain. So now I'm going to read the lectionary passage for today. This is Luke chapter 9, starting at verse 28. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory, and they were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. But since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory, and they saw the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things that they had seen. So what those 3 disciples saw on the mountain was a revelation, an epiphany. They see Moses and Elijah. They see Jesus' face transformed. They see his clothes become dazzlingly bright. And they hear the very voice of God coming from the cloud, telling him again, "This is my son. This is the chosen one. Listen to him." From God's own voice, they get the answer to the question, who is this? But now the disciples are in a tough situation because now they have to make sense of these 2 contradictory revelations: Messiah and rejected by the leaders of his own faith. So here in this chapter, in Luke 9, the paradox of Jesus is revealed. Suffering and death on the one hand, and glory revealed on a mount. But why Moses and Elijah? Why not Abraham and David, for instance? Any ideas? Wilderness? Yeah. So, well, we'll get there. Moses and Elijah each represent a pillar of the Israelites' relationship with God. Moses was the one who received the law and the covenant from God up on the mountain, right? So Moses represents the law and the covenant, and Elijah represents the prophetic tradition. And their presence there on the mountain shows the 3 disciples that yes, Jesus actually is the fulfillment and the embodiment of God's plan. Beginning all the way back with Abraham, up through the Exodus, through God's liberation of the Israelites from Egypt, all the way through the judges, the kings, and all of the prophets. Moses and Elijah's presence on the mountain signal to those three disciples that Jesus' ministry is not a fluke. His prediction of his suffering and death and resurrection, these things are not foolishness, it's not craziness, it's not madness. God's own voice tells them, listen to what he is telling you. Listen, this is the plan, as crazy and as wrong as it might seem to you. Now, the setting is also important. On a mountain, just like when Moses received the law. And the cloud, which represented God's presence to the Israelites during the Exodus and the Israelites' time in the wilderness. The cloud that was there thousands of years before, leading them through the wilderness when they made that covenant with God. That cloud is there on the mountaintop with Jesus and the disciples. And on some level, Peter seems to understand this connection to the Exodus because he kind of crazily offers to make 3 tents for them to stay in. It sounds funny to us. Really? You're going to make a tent for these people? But it actually does kind of make sense because this word for tent, it's actually, or I guess in the scripture, they translate it as
Booths.
booths. Yeah, booths. Well, God, in the Mosaic Law, tells the Israelites every year to construct booths and to live in them for 8 days as a way to commemorate the Exodus. So there is a connection there. There's another reference to the Exodus in this scene, but it's easy to miss because of the translation. The translation I read says that Jesus and Moses and Elijah were talking about Jesus's coming departure, but the word there is Exodus. It's the only time that word is used in the Gospels. So, literally, they were talking about his Exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And again, the message is that this is not a mistake. Jesus' death will not be meaningless or a mistake. It is actually an act of God. And like the Exodus, it will usher in a new covenant with the people of God. It will, initially, seem like a profound failure. It will be unacceptable to them. It will, to them, seem like the very worst possible thing that could happen. And yet, God tells them on the mountain, trust me. Trust Jesus. Listen to him. That's a very clear and simple message, isn't it? Listen. But just because it is simple does not mean, obviously, that it is easy. It's sort of like Paul was preaching last week, saying that Jesus' teaching about loving our enemies is very simple, but it's very hard. Same here. I want to read actually the scene that comes right after the Transfiguration, because it shows that this conflict and this struggle over Jesus' calling is going to continue. So on the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He's my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him, and it will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not do it. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. The disciples cannot cast out the demon. That might not seem strange, but it is. Because at the beginning of this chapter, Jesus sends out his disciples and gave them power and authority over all demons and authority to cure all diseases. They've already been given the authority. They've used it already. They've already cast out demons and done healings. But now that power is gone. Why? The text does not spell it out, but it seems that Jesus' predictions about his suffering and his death have shaken the disciples. It sounds like their faith in Jesus might be wavering. But Jesus does not relent. In the very next scene, he says, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man will be betrayed." So Jesus is trying to prepare them for this. Because that cognitive dissonance is so strong. This plan sounds like foolishness. It sounds like death. It sounds like giving up, as if Jesus is allowing evil to win. And it's no wonder that on the mountaintop, Peter says to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here, up here on the mountain." He tries to hold on to that moment. I think that's part of what the tents are about. He wants to stay up there in that moment of glory. And why wouldn't he want to stay up there? Far away from all of the hostile forces, far away from the needy crowds, right? It is good to be on the mountaintop. But Jesus knows there's more to come. And so he leads them back down the mountain. So in these coming weeks of Lent, we are also faced with the paradox of Jesus' calling, of keeping together his glory and his suffering, right? And we struggle with that, just like the disciples did. We struggle with the same questions. How could this possibly be? How could love be enough, right? How could we possibly be expected to love our enemies? How could you be expected to turn the other cheek, right? Love does not seem to be up to the task of defeating evil. Evil seems too strong. And the Transfiguration brings these questions to the very forefront. And so for the next 6 weeks, I pray that we take to heart those words of God coming from that cloud of presence. "This is my Son, the chosen one. Listen to him." Amen.
Amen.